You're in big trouble. Waitress slips billionaire a note that reveals the secret. What if the loneliest person in the room was wearing a $1,000 suit? Margaret wiped down the counter at Rosie's diner for the third time that morning, her weathered hands moving in practiced circles. The breakfast rush had died down, leaving only the familiar hum of the coffee machine and the gentle clink of silverware. Through the window, she watched a black sedan pull up to the curb. Same time, same car, same man who'd been coming here every Tuesday for 6 months. He never spoke beyond ordering his coffee and scrambled eggs, never looked up from his phone, never smiled. But Margaret noticed things others missed. The way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching, how his expensive watch couldn't hide the slight tremor in his hands. Today felt different somehow. Today she was going to do something that would change both their lives forever. Where are you watching from today? Margaret had worked at Rosie's diner for 23 years, ever since her husband passed. And she needed something to keep her hands busy and her heart from breaking completely. She'd served coffee to truckers' families celebrating birthdays and teenagers on first dates, but she'd never served anyone quite like him. The man in the expensive suit, she'd overheard someone call him Mr. Harrison, always sat in booth 7, the one tucked away in the corner where the morning light barely reached. "There's our mysterious regular," whispered Jenny, the younger waitress who worked the morning shift with Margaret. "I bet he's some kind of celebrity trying to stay under the radar." Margaret just smiled and shook her head. She'd been watching people long enough to know the difference between someone hiding from fame and someone hiding from loneliness. The first time he'd walked in, Margaret noticed his shoes. They were polished to perfection, probably cost more than she made in a month, but there was something desperate about the way he moved, like a man running from something he couldn't escape. His order was always the same: black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast. He'd eat quickly, efficiently, checking his phone constantly. Business calls, she assumed, important matters that required his immediate attention. But Margaret saw the other details. The way he lingered over his coffee when the calls stopped, how he'd glance around the diner sometimes watching families laugh together, couples holding hands across checkered tablecloths. Once she'd caught him staring at a grandfather teaching his grandson to tie his shoes by the front door. The look on his face, pure longing mixed with something that might have been regret, had stayed with her for days. "He never even says please or thank you," Jenny complained one morning after delivering his usual order. "Just nods and goes back to his phone." "Some people have no manners no matter how much money they have." Margaret defended him gently, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way he always left a $20 tip on a $12 meal. Maybe it was how carefully he folded his napkin when he finished eating, like his mother had taught him proper table manners once upon her time. This Tuesday morning started like all the others. Mr. Harrison's sedan pulled up at exactly 8:30. He walked in wearing his usual dark suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression carefully neutral. But as Margaret approached his booth with the coffee pot, she noticed something different. His hands weren't just trembling slightly. They were shaking. And when he looked up to acknowledge her, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Fear. Raw, unbridled fear. "The usual Mr. Harrison?" she asked softly, using his name for the first time. He startled clearly, surprised she knew it, and for just a moment his carefully constructed mask slipped. She saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, a weariness that went far deeper than a few sleepless nights. "Please," he said, and his voice was hoarser than usual. "And Margaret, could you make the eggs over easy today instead?" The fact that he knew her name, that he'd been paying attention to, sent a warm flutter through her chest, but it was what happened next that changed everything. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, she heard him on the phone, his voice low but urgent. "I understand the timeline," he was saying, "but I need more time. There has to be another." Wait, a pause. "No, I can't do that. Not to them. Not to my own family." Another pause, longer this time. I know what I signed, but his voice cracked slightly. Just give me one more week, please. Margaret's heart began to race as she realized she might be witnessing something far more serious than a business call. Margaret's hands trembled as she cracked the eggs into the pan, her mind racing with what she'd overheard. In 23 years of serving people, she'd learned to read the signs of trouble, and Mr. Harrison was drowning in it. She glanced over her shoulder to see him hunched over his phone, his expensive suit suddenly looking like armor that couldn't protect him from whatever battle he was fighting. When she returned with his breakfast, she noticed the newspaper folded beside his coffee cup. The business section was open to an article with a headline that made her stomach drop. Harrison Industries faces federal investigation. Below it, a smaller headline read, "Family Business Empire Built Over 3 Generations." At risk of collapse, the photo showed a younger version of Mr. Harrison standing with an elderly man and a woman holding a small child. 3 generations of the Harrison family all smiling for the camera. "Everything looks wonderful, thank you," he said when she set down his plate, but he didn't touch the food. Instead, he stared at the newspaper photo, his finger tracing the edge of the picture where the little child, probably his grandson, was laughing at something off camera. Margaret had seen that look before in her own mirror after her husband died. It was the look of someone who'd lost everything that truly mattered and was just going through the motions of living. She retreated to the kitchen, but couldn't stop watching him through the service window. He made several more phone calls, each one seeming to drain a little more life from his shoulders. At one point, she saw him pull out his wallet and remove a small, worn photograph. Even from a distance, she could tell it was old. The edges were soft with handling. The colors faded. He held it for a long moment, then quickly tucked it away when his phone rang again. "Dad, I know you're busy." She heard him say, his voice gentler now. "I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "No, everything's fine. How's Tommy doing with his baseball?" Another pause, and Margaret saw his face soften. "Tell him Grandpa James is proud of him, okay? And tell Sarah I love her." The call ended, and she watched him bury his face in his hands. That's when Margaret made her decision. She'd been a mother once, long ago, before the miscarriage that broke her heart and changed everything. She recognized the sound of a man trying to protect his family from his own failures. Her husband used to make those same kinds of calls during his illness, pretending everything was fine when the medical bills were crushing them, trying to shoulder all the worry alone. She pulled out her order pad and began to write. Not an order this time, but something else entirely. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate. "I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but I know you're not a bad man. Bad men don't tip breakfast waitresses $20 or keep pictures of their grandchildren in their wallets. Whatever happened, there are people who love you, who would rather face the truth with you than lose you to pride. You don't have to carry this alone." She folded the note carefully, her heart pounding as she realized what she was about to do. Margaret had minded her own business for 23 years, serving coffee and keeping her observations to herself. But something about this man's quiet desperation reminded her of her own darkest days, when a kind word from a stranger might have made all the difference. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes in someone's life. She took a deep breath, picked up the coffee pot, and walked toward booth 7, knowing that whatever happened next would either help heal a broken man or cost her the job that had been her anchor for over 2 decades. Margaret's legs felt unsteady as she approached booth 7, the folded note hidden beneath the coffee pot. Mr. Harrison was staring out the window, his breakfast untouched and growing cold. Up close, she could see the dark circles under his eyes, the way his usually perfect appearance seemed frayed around the edges. His phone buzzed constantly, but for the first time since she'd known him, he wasn't answering. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded absently, still lost in whatever thoughts were consuming him. As she poured, her hand brushed against his, and she felt the note slip from her fingers onto the table beside his plate. He looked down, startled, then up at her with confusion. "What's this?" he asked, unfolding the paper. Margaret busied herself wiping down the already clean table, not trusting herself to speak, as she watched his expression change. His eyes moved across her words, once then again, more slowly. When he finished reading, he looked up at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Vulnerability mixed with something that might have been hope. "How did you know?" he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but in it she heard the sound of a dam beginning to crack. "About the pictures, I mean. I thought I was careful." Margaret sat down the coffee pot and slid into the booth across from him, something she'd never done with a customer before. "I've been watching people for a long time, Mr. Harrison. You learn to see things. The way you hold that old photograph like it's the most precious thing in the world. The way your voice changes when you talk to your family. The way you sit a little straighter when children laugh in here." She paused, gathering courage. "And the way you look like a man who's about to lose everything that matters to him. James Harrison." She'd learned his first name from the newspaper, stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, his eyes filled with tears. "I built something I thought would last forever," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "3 generations of my family put their hearts into Harrison Industries. My grandfather started with nothing but a toolbox and a dream. My father expanded it into something respectable, and he laughed bitterly. "I got greedy. I made deals. I shouldn't have made trusted people. I shouldn't have trusted. Now the federal investigators are saying I have to choose. Give them the names of family members who were involved in decisions they're calling fraudulent, or watch everything. My grandfather built Get Destroyed." Margaret felt her heart break for him. "But your family that they don't know. How can I tell my son that his children might lose their college funds because of my mistakes? How can I look my father in the eye and tell him that the company he spent his whole life building might disappear because I was too proud to ask for help when things got complicated?" He pulled out the worn photograph she'd seen him looking at earlier. It showed a much younger James with an elderly man beside a small storefront. "That's my grandfather on the day he opened his first shop. He used to tell me that a man's character isn't measured by how much money he makes, but by how he treats people when nobody's watching." Margaret studied the photograph, seeing the hope and determination in both men's faces. "He sounds like a wise man. He was, and he'd be ashamed of what I've become." James's phone buzzed again, and this time when he looked at it, his face went pale. "That's my lawyer. I have until Friday to make my decision. 3 days to choose between betraying my family or destroying their legacy." Margaret reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments," she whispered, then continued more directly to James. "Maybe the choice isn't as impossible as it seems. Maybe there's a third option you haven't considered yet." For the first time in months, James Harrison looked directly into another person's eyes and allowed himself to believe that hope might still be possible. "What kind of third option?" James asked, leaning forward with the first spark of genuine hope Margaret had seen in his eyes. She could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that her next words might help save not just a business, but a family's faith in each other. "The kind your grandfather would have chosen," she said simply. "You said he measured character by how someone treats people when nobody's watching. But maybe it's also about how someone acts when everybody is watching, when the whole world is judging them." She gestured toward the newspaper article. What if instead of choosing between your family and your business, you chose them, all of them? Your grandfather's memory, your father's pride, your son's future, your grandson's inheritance. What if you told the truth, all of it, and trusted that the people who really matter would stand with you?" James shook his head. "You don't understand. If I admit to what I did wrong, I'll face criminal charges, prison time, and if I involve my family in the investigation, they could face charges too. There's no way to protect everyone, but there might be a way to protect what matters most," Margaret insisted. "Yeah, I've seen a lot of people come through that door over the years, Mr. Harrison. Some are running from their problems, and some are running towards solutions. The ones who run towards solutions, they're the ones who remember what your grandfather said about character. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street where people were hurrying to their jobs, their appointments, their own sets of problems and possibilities. My husband died of cancer 24 years, she said quietly. Toward the end, he wanted to hide how sick he really was. He thought he was protecting me from worry. But what he was really doing was stealing our last chance to face it together, to make decisions together, to say the things that needed saying. James listened intently as she continued. The day I convinced him to tell our families the truth was the day we stopped being alone with our fear. Yes, there were tears. Yes, there was anger about things that couldn't be changed. But there was also love and support, and people willing to help carry the weight. She turned back to face him. Your family might surprise you with how strong they are when they're fighting alongside you, instead of being protected from you. James was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of his grandfather. But what if I lose everything anyway? What if telling the truth doesn't save the company or protect anyone from the consequences? Then at least you'll lose it honestly, Margaret said. And your grandson will grow up knowing that when his grandfather faced the hardest decision of his life, he chose courage over convenience. That's the kind of inheritance that lasts longer than money. James's phone rang. He looked at the screen, his lawyer again, and for the first time, he let it go to voicemail. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he found a different number. His son's name appeared on the screen. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales, Margaret thought to herself as she watched James take the deepest breath she'd ever seen anyone take. Michael, James said when his son answered. It's Dad. I know you're at work, but I need to talk to you about something important. About the company, about some mistakes I've made, and about why I'm going to need your help to fix them. His voice was steadier now, filled with the quiet strength that comes from finally choosing the right path instead of the easy one. The real conversation, the one that would determine the future of 4 generations of the Harrison family, was just beginning. 3 months later, Margaret was refilling the sugar dispensers when she heard the familiar sound of a car door closing outside. She looked up to see James Harrison walking toward the diner. But this time he wasn't alone. A younger man who shared his silver blue eyes held the door open for him, and behind them, a woman carrying a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. James had been coming to Rosie's every Tuesday since that morning when everything changed, but the conversations were different now. Instead of hushed, desperate phone calls, she'd overheard him talking to lawyers about cooperation agreements, to his father about restructuring the company, to his son about shared responsibility. The federal investigation was still ongoing, but James was facing it with his family beside him, rather than trying to shield them from it. Margaret, James called out as they approached the counter, his voice warm with genuine affection. I'd like you to meet my family. This is my son Michael, my daughter-in-law Sarah, and this little guy is Tommy. The boy peeked shyly at her from his mother's arms, clutching a small baseball glove. It's wonderful to meet you all, Margaret said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. I've heard so much about you. She'd watched James transform over these past months, seen him grow from a man carrying the weight of the world alone to someone who'd learned to share both burdens and joys. We wanted to thank you, Sarah said, shifting Tommy to her hip. James told us about your conversation about the note you gave him. It took courage to reach out to someone you barely knew. Margaret waved off the thanks, but Michael stepped forward. No, really. Dad told us he was planning to. He paused, glancing at his father, who nodded encouragingly. He was planning to take all the blame for everything, even things he didn't do, to try to protect us. If you hadn't helped him see there was another way. Your father found his own courage, Margaret said firmly. I just reminded him it was there. James smiled and pulled out his wallet, removing that same worn photograph she'd seen him looking at so many times. I want to show you something, he said, unfolding it carefully. This is my grandfather the day he opened Harrison Tools. But look at the back. He turned it over to reveal faded handwriting for Jimmy. Remember that a family business isn't about the business, it's about the family. Love, Grandpa Joe. I'd been carrying this for 30 years and never really read what he wrote, James admitted. It took a wise waitress to help me understand what he was trying to tell me. Tommy squirmed in his mother's arms, wanting to explore, so Sarah sat him down. He immediately ran to the window, pressing his nose against the glass to watch the cars go by. James's eyes followed his grandson with such pure love that Margaret felt her heart swell. The company might not survive the investigation, James said quietly. We're cooperating fully, and that might mean significant penalties, maybe even criminal charges for some of the decisions I made. But we're facing it together now. And you know what my father told me? He's prouder of me now than he's ever been. Margaret nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is the only way to find what you actually need. As the family settled into booth 7, the same booth where James had spent so many mornings alone, Margaret brought over a fresh pot of coffee and a cup of hot chocolate for Tommy. The little boy looked up at her with his grandfather's eyes and said, "Thank you, Miss Margaret. Grandpa James says you're the nicest lady in the whole world." If you enjoyed this story, please remember to leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply remind someone they don't have to face their troubles alone. Thank you for joining us for this story of courage, family, and the unexpected connections that can change everything. Until next time, remember that kindness always matters, especially when it's offered to someone who feels like they don't deserve it.